In the summer of 216 BC, on a flat plain near the town of Cannae in southeastern Italy, the Roman Republic sent roughly 80,000 soldiers to destroy a Carthaginian army of maybe 50,000. By noon, between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans were dead. It was the single worst military defeat in Roman history, possibly the worst single-day battlefield loss of any army in the ancient world. Generals, senators, 2 consuls, hundreds of Rome's most prominent citizens, all killed in the space of a few hours on a dusty plain that Rome would not forget for generations. And here is the thing that makes this story so much stranger than it sounds. Someone had warned them, not in some vague prophetic sense, not in a "beware the Ides of March" way. A Roman general had laid out in plain, practical terms exactly why marching 80,000 men into a pitched battle against Hannibal Barca was going to end in catastrophe. His name was Quintus Fabius Maximus, and the Roman Senate had basically told him to shut up. So, what happened? How did Rome's most innovative military thinker end up sidelined at the exact moment his strategy was most needed? And why, after the bodies at Cannae had been counted, did the world finally understand what Fabius had been doing all along? This is the story of the general who won by refusing to fight. To understand why Fabius Maximus looks like a genius in hindsight, you first have to understand just how terrifyingly good Hannibal Barca actually was. Because without that context, the cautious strategy Fabius employed looks like cowardice. With it, it looks like the only sane response to an almost impossible situation. Hannibal was born in Carthage, in modern-day Tunisia, around 247 BC. His father was Hamilcar Barca, one of Carthage's greatest generals, a man who fought Rome to a standstill in Sicily during the First Punic War. According to the ancient historian Livy, Hamilcar made the young Hannibal swear an oath of eternal enmity toward Rome before allowing him to accompany the Carthaginian army on campaign. Whether that story is completely accurate or not, Hannibal certainly lived as if it were true. By the time he was in his late 20s, Hannibal was commanding Carthaginian forces in Spain. He was tactically brilliant, personally brave, and possessed of something rarer than either of those qualities, a genuine strategic imagination. He did not just want to win battles, he wanted to win a war, and he had a plan to do it. In 218 BC, Hannibal did something that nobody, including Rome, considered seriously possible. He marched an army of roughly 50,000 infantry, 9,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants from Spain, through southern France, across the Pyrenees, along the Rhone River, and then over the Alps into northern Italy. The Alpine crossing alone is one of the most extraordinary military achievements in ancient history. The exact route is still debated by historians and geographers today, but the conditions were brutal by any route. Snow, ice, hostile mountain tribes attacking the column from above, narrow paths where a single stumble meant a 1,000-foot drop. Hannibal lost maybe half his men just getting over the mountains. He arrived in the Po Valley in northern Italy with perhaps 26,000 battle-hardened survivors and a handful of his original elephants. And then he immediately started winning. The Roman army that came out to meet him at the Trebia River in late 218 BC was outmaneuvered and mauled. Roughly 20,000 Romans died. A few months later, in the spring of 217, the new consul Gaius Flaminius pursued Hannibal's army along the northern shore of Lake Trasimene in central Italy. What happened next became one of the most studied ambushes in military history. Hannibal had positioned his entire army in the hills above the fog-covered road along the lake's edge. Flaminius marched his column of roughly 30,000 men straight into it without proper scouting. The Carthaginians hit the Romans from 3 sides simultaneously. The Romans were trapped between the hills and the lake. 15,000 were killed in less than 4 hours. Flaminius himself died in the fighting. Thousands more drowned trying to swim to safety. The lake reportedly ran red. Rome had now lost 2 major armies in the space of a few months. The city was in genuine panic. People were fleeing. The Senate convened in emergency session. Hannibal was less than 100 miles from Rome itself. This is the moment the Roman Senate made a decision they had not made in over a century. They appointed a dictator. The Romans had an actual constitutional mechanism for this. When the Republic faced an existential crisis, they could suspend normal governmental processes and appoint a single man with near absolute authority for a maximum of 6 months. The title was meant to convey emergency power combined with emergency responsibility. The man they chose was Quintus Fabius Maximus Verrucosus. He was already in his early 60s, which in the ancient world was genuinely old. He was a former consul, a man of deep religious conviction, and someone who had spent years watching Roman armies succeed and fail. His full cognomen would eventually include the word cunctator, which is Latin for the delayer. He did not earn that nickname as a compliment. Not at first. Fabius assessed the situation with the kind of cold clarity that tends to get mistaken for timidity in people who lack it. He recognized several things immediately. First, Hannibal's army was extraordinarily good in open-pitched battle. His cavalry, in particular, was vastly superior to Rome's. Second, Hannibal was operating deep in enemy territory without a reliable supply line. Third, Hannibal needed either a decisive victory that forced Rome to negotiate, or the defection of Rome's Italian allies. Neither of those things was going to happen while Hannibal's army was slowly starving. So Fabius decided not to fight. He took his army into the hills above Hannibal's line of march. He watched. He followed. He cut off foraging parties. He picked off supply trains. He engaged Hannibal's isolated detachments, but refused every invitation to fight on open ground where Hannibal's cavalry advantage would be decisive. The hills around Samnium and Campania in south-central Italy became Fabius's battlefield. Not the flat plains where Hannibal wanted to fight. The rugged terrain neutralized the Carthaginian cavalry. It forced Hannibal's army to disperse to forage, which made those foraging parties vulnerable, and it gave Fabius time. Time was the one resource Hannibal could not replenish. The strategy was, in retrospect, genuinely elegant. But in the moment, it looked to basically everyone watching like a Roman general was afraid to fight a foreigner on Italian soil. The complaints started almost immediately. Hannibal, who was tactically brilliant and psychologically sophisticated in equal measure, understood exactly what Fabius was doing and why it worked. He also understood that he could potentially break the strategy, not by defeating Fabius militarily, but by making Fabius politically untenable back in Rome. So Hannibal did something deliberately provocative. He marched his army through Campania, one of the most fertile and prosperous regions in Italy, burning and looting as he went. But he carefully avoided the estate of Fabius Maximus. He left it untouched. The message to Rome was unmistakable. Either Fabius was a coward who refused to protect Roman citizens from a foreign invader, or he had some kind of arrangement with the Carthaginians. The people of Rome, watching their allies' farms burn while their army sat in the hills doing nothing, began to wonder. Fabius's own master of horse, a man named Marcus Minucius Rufus, was openly contemptuous of the strategy. Minucius wanted to fight, he said so loudly and repeatedly. When Fabius briefly left the army to conduct religious rites in Rome, Minucius took a detachment and actually engaged a portion of Hannibal's army, achieving what looked like a minor tactical success. Rome went wild. The people, who could vote on certain matters even in a dictatorship under some interpretations, elevated Minucius to co-equal authority with Fabius. Think about what had just happened. The Romans had found a workaround to their own dictator, because the dictator's strategy was too boring and too patient for their taste. Fabius, to his credit, did not blow up. He watched Minucius carefully. He waited. A few weeks later, Hannibal, who had been studying Minucius just as carefully, set a trap. He positioned a hidden force in an area where the terrain looked favorable to attack. He let Minucius see what appeared to be a vulnerable Carthaginian position. Minucius charged in. The trap closed. Minucius was surrounded and on the verge of annihilation when Fabius appeared with the rest of the Roman army and rescued him. The moment was not subtle. Minucius returned command to Fabius, reportedly calling him his father in recognition of having saved his life and his army. It was a complete vindication of exactly the strategic caution that Minucius had mocked. But Fabius's term as dictator was ending. The 6-month constitutional limit was approaching, and Rome's political culture was not built for patience. If you are finding this story as fascinating as we do, hit subscribe. We cover military history, strategy, and the moments that changed the ancient world every week. When Fabius stepped down, Rome elected 2 new consuls for 216 BC. Their names were Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus. Varro, in particular, was deeply hostile to the Fabian strategy. He reportedly campaigned on a promise to end the war decisively, to stop chasing Hannibal through the hills and bring him to battle on the plain, where Rome's superior numbers could simply overwhelm him. Paulus was more cautious. He apparently had some sympathy for the Fabian approach. But under the Roman system, the 2 consuls alternated daily command of the army. And when it was Varro's day to command, on August 2nd, 216 BC, near the town of Cannae in Apulia, he ordered the attack. Hannibal had picked the ground. That matters enormously. The site of Cannae was flat, perfect for cavalry, and the wind that day, a hot, dusty Italian summer wind called the Volturnus, blew directly into the faces of the advancing Romans. Hannibal positioned his weaker allied infantry in the center of his line and his best troops on the flanks. His 2 wings of cavalry, the best in the ancient world at that point, anchored both sides. When the Roman legions pushed forward, they drove into the soft center of Hannibal's line. The center bent but did not break. It absorbed the Roman advance and pulled the entire Roman formation forward into a deepening pocket. Then the flanks, Hannibal's hardened veterans on both sides, swung inward. The cavalry, having routed Rome's mounted forces on both sides, came around behind. The Romans were encircled completely. 80,000 men packed so tightly together that soldiers in the interior could not raise their weapons to fight back. What followed was not really a battle. It was a systematic killing operation that lasted most of the afternoon. Between 50,000 and 70,000 Romans died at Cannae. The sources vary, but even the lowest estimates make Cannae the worst military disaster in Roman history. Among the dead were one of the consuls, Aemilius Paulus, 80 senators, hundreds of men from Rome's equestrian class, the backbone of its administrative and military officer corps. Varro, the consul who ordered the attack, survived and reportedly fled. When the news reached Rome, the city fell into something close to collective breakdown. Multiple senior magistrates were killed. Rome's direct military strength was shattered. Several Italian cities that had remained loyal began to reconsider their allegiances. Capua, one of the largest and most important cities in Italy, defected to Carthage. Hannibal was offering any Roman ally who switched sides freedom from Roman taxation and a share of the spoils of war. And here is the pivot that defines the entire story. Hannibal's officers, after the battle, reportedly urged him to march immediately on Rome. The road was open. The city was in chaos. The moment was ripe. Hannibal refused. His most brilliant cavalry commander, Hannibal, is said to have told him, "You know how to win a victory, Hannibal, but you do not know how to use one." Hannibal's response, according to Livy, was that he needed time to consider. Hannibal reportedly said that the gods do not give everything to the same man. Whether the exact exchange happened precisely that way or not, the strategic reality was clear. Hannibal did not march on Rome. Why not? Partly because he lacked siege equipment heavy enough to take Rome's walls. Partly because he was hoping the Italian allies would defect en masse and simply deliver Rome to him without a siege. Partly because even after Cannae, Hannibal's army had taken casualties it could not easily replace. His supply lines back to Carthage were tenuous at best. In other words, exactly the vulnerabilities Fabius had identified were still there. Cannae was a catastrophic tactical victory for Hannibal and an absolute strategic dead end. He had nowhere to go from it except to wait. And now, finally, Rome listened to Fabius. The Senate did not appoint him dictator again. His formal authority as dictator had ended, but his strategic approach became the official Roman strategy for the remainder of the Italian phase of the war. No more pitched battles in open terrain against Hannibal. Harassment, attrition. Cutting supply lines, letting Hannibal's army slowly grind itself down in the Italian peninsula while Rome rebuilt. Fabius himself returned to active command, methodically retaking cities that had defected after Cannae. His approach was patient and systematic. In 209 BC, he retook Tarentum, one of the major Greek cities in southern Italy that had gone over to Hannibal. Meanwhile, Hannibal's situation in Italy was deteriorating. The mass defection of Rome's Italian allies that he had counted on never fully materialized. Most cities stayed loyal to Rome or were retaken before Hannibal could properly consolidate them. Carthage, preoccupied with its own wars in Spain and Africa, and increasingly worried about Roman naval power, sent inadequate reinforcements. When Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal finally crossed the Alps with a relief army in 207 BC, he was intercepted and defeated at the Metarus River before he could even reach his brother. The first Hasdrubal's severed head, according to the sources, was thrown into Hannibal's camp. Hannibal had been in Italy for over a decade at this point. He had fought and won brilliantly in every major engagement, and he was losing the war. This is the Fabian paradox in its purest form. The man who never beat Hannibal in the field was actually winning. The man who beat Rome at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae was actually losing. Strategy and tactics are different games. Hannibal was playing tactics at a level almost nobody in history has matched. Fabius was playing strategy, and strategy, played long enough, beats tactics almost every time. Rome eventually took the war out of Italy entirely. A younger general named Publius Cornelius Scipio had been studying the entire Hannibalic campaign with great intensity. He had survived Cannae as a young officer. He had watched what worked and what did not, and he drew a conclusion that built directly on the Fabian logic, even if it pointed in a more aggressive direction. If Hannibal could not be beaten in Italy, and if waiting for him to die of old age in Calabria was going to take another generation, then the answer was to attack Carthage directly, force Hannibal to come home to defend his own city. Take the war to Africa on Rome's terms. The Roman Senate was nervous about this, partly because it was bold and risky, partly because Scipio was young and confident in ways that made older senators uncomfortable. But eventually, in 204 BC, Scipio landed in North Africa with a Roman army. It worked. Hannibal was recalled from Italy to defend Carthage. He had spent 15 years in Italy without ever being driven out by force, which is itself an almost unbelievable military achievement. But he came home to a Carthage that had been weakened, and whose best cavalry commander, Massinissa of Numidia, had switched to the Roman side. In 202 BC, Hannibal and Scipio met at Zama, on the North African plain. Scipio had studied Hannibal's own tactics carefully enough to reverse engineer a version of the Cannae encirclement. Hannibal's veteran infantry, which had fought for 15 years and never lost, performed brilliantly. But without his cavalry advantage, the battle tipped. The Numidian cavalry under Massinissa returned from the pursuit of Carthaginian horse and hit the Carthaginian rear. Hannibal lost. The Second Punic War ended. Carthage sued for peace. Scipio returned to Rome as Scipio Africanus, one of the great heroes of the Republic. He deserved the honor entirely. But the strategy that made Zama possible was not invented at Zama. It ran in a direct line back to an old man in the Italian hills, watching Hannibal's army and refusing, day after day and month after month, to give his enemy the battle he wanted. Fabius Maximus died in 203 BC, just before Zama, having lived long enough to see the war in Italy effectively over, and Rome's eventual victory clearly in sight. Ancient sources say he died in poverty because he had sold his own land to ransom Roman prisoners of war, and the Senate had not reimbursed him. He was around 80 years old. He had been a consul 5 times, a dictator twice, and the man most responsible for keeping Rome alive during the most dangerous years of the war. And he had spent most of that time being called a coward by people whose armies got destroyed because they did not listen to him. The Fabian strategy did not die with him. It has been rediscovered and reapplied in every century since, by commanders who faced a similar asymmetry, an enemy who was tactically superior in direct battle but strategically vulnerable to a long, grinding, resource-intensive war of attrition. George Washington faced exactly this problem during the American Revolutionary War. His Continental Army could not beat British regulars in a straight-pitched battle on open ground, at least not consistently and not at the beginning. So he largely refused to fight that battle. He kept his army intact. He chose terrain. He fell back when necessary. He wore down British willingness to continue rather than trying to destroy British military capacity outright. His critics called him Fabius. They did not mean it as a compliment. History judged it differently. Mao Zedong articulated something almost identical in his writings on guerrilla warfare in the 1930s. A weaker force does not meet a stronger force in the terrain where the stronger force excels. It retreats, it disperses, it harasses, it trades space for time and time for strategic exhaustion. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces used precisely this logic against the United States military in Vietnam, with results that need no elaboration. The Fabian insight keeps recurring because the underlying reality keeps recurring. Tactical brilliance is not the same as strategic wisdom. The ability to win a fight is not the same as the ability to win a war. And sometimes the most courageous thing a commander can do is refuse to fight. There is a particular kind of moral courage required to sit still while your allies are burning, while your political enemies are calling you a coward, while your own officers are demanding action, while the enemy is marching through the richest farmland in your country and looting at will. The pressure to do something, anything, to demonstrate resolve and courage and decisiveness is enormous. It is a pressure that has destroyed more armies than enemy cavalry ever did. Fabius absorbed that pressure for years. He had seen enough Roman overconfidence to know what it produced. He had the patience, the political toughness, and the strategic clarity to hold his course when almost nobody around him believed in it. And then Cannae happened, and suddenly everyone believed in it. That is perhaps the most bitter part of the Fabian story. He was right from the beginning. He articulated his strategy clearly. He demonstrated it working repeatedly in the hills above Campania. He even rescued Minucius when Minucius charged ahead without him and nearly got annihilated. And Rome still had to lose 50,000 men in a single afternoon before it accepted that the patient general watching from the hills had understood the situation better than anyone else. There is something almost universal in that pattern. The cautious voice that says, "This is not the right battle," is very rarely the most popular voice in any room. It requires a particular combination of ego and humility, confidence in one's own analysis, combined with genuine indifference to how that analysis looks in the short term. That is genuinely rare. Most people who have those qualities end up being called cowards by people who turn out to be wrong. Quintus Fabius Maximus was called a coward for years. Then Rome sent 80,000 men into the plains of Apulia, and they were dead by sundown. And after that, no one called Fabius a coward anymore. The lesson Fabius would probably teach, if you could sit down with him in 217 BC and ask him directly, would not be complicated. Know your enemy's strength. Know your own vulnerability. Do not fight in the terrain where the enemy excels. Protect your army's existence above all else, because a living army that has not won yet is infinitely more valuable than a dead army that tried. Be patient. Be genuinely, stubbornly, infuriatingly patient. Take the abuse. Hold the course. Let time work for you. And if someone calls you a coward for it, well, wait a few months. The results tend to speak clearly enough. The Second Punic War is over 2,000 years in the past. But the Fabian strategy is not a historical curiosity. It is a living framework for thinking about any situation where direct confrontation with a stronger opponent is likely to be suicidal. Business, politics, military conflict, any domain where resources and patience can compensate for an immediate disadvantage in raw power, the logic of Fabius applies. Do not fight the battle your enemy wants to fight. Fight the one you can win, even if that means not fighting at all for a while. Hannibal Barca was probably the greatest battlefield tactician who ever lived. He crossed the Alps with elephants. He won at Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae. He spent 15 years in the heart of enemy territory and was never defeated in a major engagement on Italian soil. He did all of this against the most disciplined and well-organized military power of the ancient world. And he lost the war to an old man who refused to fight him. If you enjoyed this, subscribe for more military history, strategy, and the stories behind the moments that changed the ancient world. There is a lot more where this came from, and you will not want to miss it.